The Resilience Imperative, Remaking the CED Agenda. It's brought to you by the Canadian CED Network, a national network of local organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. If you like the session today, consider becoming a member or signing up for our free e-newsletters. We'll provide more information on that later on. The session is part of a new webinar series that CEDNet is launching that will offer monthly sessions for the next year on topics such as the versatility of co-ops, financial management for CED organizations, charitable status for community economic development, and others. But it also builds on the long experience of CEDNet's International Committee, which has organized previous sessions over the past couple of years on community forestry in BC and Nepal, the co-construction of public policy for the social and solidarity economy in Mali and around the world, or the impacts of fair trade and successful strategies for community tourism. All of these past sessions are on our website, and we'll provide links to them in a follow-up email. The session today is divided into two parts. The first part will be a conversation where I will mercilessly grill our guest speaker, Mike Lewis. That will last for about 30 minutes if all goes well, and if he survives that, you'll have a turn with about 25 minutes for a question and answer period. Yes, encouraging, eh? Get ready. The conversation will focus on the ideas presented in the Resilience Imperative, Mike's new book published by New Society Publishers earlier this year. Now, despite what you might think, there are not all that many books on community economic development that are put out each year in Canada. So when a new one comes out, it tends to get our attention here at CEDNet. But this is not just another book. 20 years ago, Mike Lewis was already one of the leading voices for community economic development in Canada. As editor of Making Waves, he saw firsthand how local action can help turn around impoverished neighborhoods and communities. But as his work expanded internationally and across sectors, the emerging spectres of climate change and peak oil cast community renewal in a new light. The topics that Mike and his co-author, Pat Conaty of the New Economics Foundation in the UK pulled together in the Resilience Imperative are familiar to community economic development practitioners. They're talking about energy, food, housing, finance, and others. But what's new about the way they deal with these topics is the ecological context that creates a greater need for these changes and the integration of those various fields of development into what they call a true C change, C being social, ecological, and economic, SEE. The book is full of practical examples of how economies can be reinvented at a more local and regional scale in a way that buffers communities from the economic shocks and the global transition to lower carbon economies will likely entail. The Resilience Imperative is firmly grounded in research carried out by the BC Alberta Social Economy Research Alliance, of which Mike was director, and it has an impressive list of endorsements from people like David Suzuki, Bill McKibben, Hazel Henderson, Gar Alpovitz, Robin Murray, and many others. So before we get into the substance of the book, we just wanted to get a sense of how many people are familiar with the book, or who's read it, where people are at in terms of the content. So we've got a quick poll up here. You should be able to see pop up on the screen. You have a number of choices. You can say whether you've read it, whether you have it and are planning to read it, whether you're planning to buy it, whether today will be the deciding factor and whether you order it or you're waiting for a better option. So while people answer, you can throw up your answers there on the poll. Let me introduce Mike Lewis. Here you have Mike Lewis. Oops. I see that's actually the before picture. How embarrassing. Let me see if I can fix that and get the after picture. There we go.
You're a rat, Mike.
You can see what a difference 35 years in CED will make. Mike Lewis has been engaged in community economic development, development finance, and the social and cooperative economy for over 35 years. He's a prolific author and respected practitioner who's been involved with entrepreneurial development, network building, strategic assistance to CED organizations, and curriculum design for community resilience. One of the best parts of all that experience is that he's documented most of it along the way and made it available both through articles in Making Waves magazine and other resources that are all publicly available on the community renewal.ca website. They have a ton of resources there, so I highly recommend it. He's also director, as well as being past director, I mentioned the BC Alberta Social Economy Research Alliance. There's a new project, the Partnership Development Program, that continues that work. And by way of full disclosure, I should also say that he's one of the founding members of CEDNet and one of the driving forces in its creation. So thanks for joining us today, Mike. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. As you know, I've become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the book that you and Pat have written. It pulls together so many disparate strands of community economic development work at a time when they're needed more than ever. Can you give us a snapshot of what you want to cover in the presentation today?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Mike. Well, let me just start by saying thank you, everybody, for attending. I was intrigued when Mike sent me the agenda title, which essentially is a question of whether or not the agenda that we've been pursuing in community economic development needs to be remade in some way in light of the resilience imperative. What I'm going to do in this presentation is just remind us of the key functions that any practitioner thinking about renewal or revitalization of a community needs to think about, and that has framed some of our best practice in Canada and the United States over the last 40 years. I'm going to introduce some particular issues around the whole notion of economic growth, which is the imperative we now live under. I'm going to take a minute to share parts of my personal journey that actually led to, with another long-in-the-tooth practitioner, Pat Conaty, spending 3.5 years writing a book. That I've written a number of things, but I've never spent that long writing anything. And then I want to introduce some of the core themes of the book, which Mike has begun to do, and then just share a couple of innovations of the more than 30 in the book that, as we're getting feedback from folks in different parts of the world, folks are finding so compelling. And really the discussion about how, in light of a very different context than when community economic development started, in the late 60s, really, in the United States, as a distinct field, how today, in a very different context, the resilience imperative is compelling us, we believe, to transition to a more decentralized, democratic, and diversified economy, much closer to where we live than the globalized model we are living within. So I want to, so I don't have control here, Mike, of the slides.
You should if you hit the arrow key on your keyboard. It's not working.
Oh, no. Okay, it's not working. Okay, let me see. Isn't there another way to do this?
Yeah, you should have arrow keys underneath the...
Yeah, okay, let me try that.
While you work that out, there we go. Let's have a quick look at the poll. You see the results. You can see there's a few people that have, only a couple people that have actually read the book, some that have it on hand, and a few that are waiting to be inspired. So this would be a good overview today.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I just want to take a bit of time just to review the basics of what we try to do in community economic development. And let me just note at the beginning that my understanding of the roots of this field that many of us work in really comes out of the civil rights movement in the United States, where people actually began to see that the fight that they had waged for political rights, while important and gains were made, in fact, the economic power and the way it was exercised still left people marginalized. And the question became, how do we organize in a way that can exercise more control at the community level and, in fact, drive a process of revitalization and renewal from the base up. It's a fascinating history. In Canada, basically through being inspired by the United States in part, and that history there, New Dawn was put forward in 1977. Community Futures Development Corporations had its very root beginnings in 1975. You saw the beginnings of organizing in Montreal around Réseau, the emergence of Quint Development Corporation, the inner cities of Saskatoon, Manitoba, the North End Renewal Corporation, later on in the 90s, and Aboriginal Development Corporations. All of these examples kind of were focused on a territory, and we're trying to put some of these pieces together and we're build priorities based on what their assessment, what their assessment of the context was. You know, so did we need to increase accessibility to credit? What was the relationship to getting people ready, willing, and able, you know, to participate in the labor market? How do we build local ownership? And how do these things link across to some of the key social functions? And so the weaving together of economic and social functions has been kind of a hallmark of community economic development. But throughout the period that this started in the late 60s, right up, I think, until very recently, you know, economic growth has been the order of the day. And among the arguments we use to CED practitioners is that, you know, we want to have, for the constituents and neighborhoods and people we're working with and are part of, we want to have a bigger share of the growing pie because it's fair and it's economically smart to make sure it's more fairly distributed, that impoverishment has economic impacts on the whole of society, and that we thought and think that by putting more resources in the hands of the community, we can connect the dots in a way that's impossible for governments and the private sector to do on their own.
I remember some of the early quotes about a rising tide not lifting all boats. And
yeah, exactly.
And growth. And the approach was that CED needed to help to be the sort of undergirding so that the rising tide did actually lift all the boats.
Yeah, that's essentially been kind of a core assumption that in community economic development and many other parts of our lives that we've all shared in different ways, and especially from a social justice perspective, you know, that was the nature of our struggle, our commitment, and our mission.
So you're saying that doesn't work anymore?
Well, I'm not saying that it doesn't work anymore. What I'm saying is this. Well, let me give you a little, gosh, how do I get this going? Okay. I want to give you a hamster's perspective on this idea of economic growth and perpetual growth. So I'm going to reveal my deep knowledge of mathematics in the process. This little guy that was just born is going to reach its sexual maturity at about 6 weeks. And it's going to double its weight every week. Now, the question is, what happens if instead of leveling off at the end of 6 weeks, it carried on growing, continuing to double its weight for a year? Well, folks, it's a 9 billion pound hamster when it hits its first birthday. And if it kept eating at the same ratio of food to body weight, that hamster daily intake would be greater than the total annual amount of maize or corn produced in the world. The reality, folks, is we are in overshoot, and I think most of the people on this call know it. And it's because of oil that we've been able to do this. It's extended our influence and our impact. And as we know, oil and the emissions that come from the various fossil fuels we depend on are at the heart of carbon emissions, which are at the heart of our climate crisis. So we've essentially operated on the basis that economic growth will determine the viability of social and ecological goals being met. Bill Clinton, you'll recall, It's the economy, stupid. Obama, yes we can. How many times have we heard President Obama say, well, we're not there yet, but we're getting economic growth. It's a major priority. American greatness as the world's economic leader will be restored, right? The HOPE agenda, rooted in growth. Harper's entire agenda is framed around maximizing economic growth to ensure jobs and Canadian prosperity, and the tar sands and pipelines and a number of other fossil fuels, and we can hardly wait to get into the Arctic as the ice melts. So we've got a bit of a problem. Now, I've spent my life working from a social justice perspective and reinserting social goals into the heart of economic life. And so what happened? And I think personal stories, and I'll just very briefly share the reason why I kind of started to shift gears. This is where I lived, not now, but for 35 years on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Every fall, exactly this time of year, I would make a pilgrimage to the river not far from where we lived, 3 miles or so, called the Stamp. I called it the Tramp to the Stamp, and we went there in order to look at this, which was salmon moving up these falls, hitting the rocks, bouncing back, persisting, going up to sow their seed in order to sustain and perpetuate the species. Now, 11 years ago, probably sometime this week, or 9 years ago, I took this little girl at 3 years old, which was my first grandchild, and we headed to the Stamp for the Tramp. And there became the point at which I had a kind of personal epiphany. And the epiphany came from a couple of things. One is, the day before, I'd been reading a scientific journal article on salmon that essentially said, very simply, that the temperature gradient within which salmon can survive is about 2 degrees. And that it is not going to stay at that given current trends in terms of increasing temperatures, and that 40 years from now, salmon could well not exist as a species. And but that little girl, watching the salmon together and seeing the excitement on her face, I thought, geez, this little girl's grandchildren may never see this. And that, folks, sent me on a path. And going down that path and trying to understand, well, what's going on here? What's the larger context, which seemed to be set to create very bad consequences for us as human beings and other creatures. I went into a period of despair. I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. As a good codependent, I read vociferously books to try and figure out what was going on, and it ended up changing my life in a number of different ways. But the basic was that I became to understand something that is it's easy to say, but it's hard to really take in. It is that really it's the environment, it's the ecological reality that frames what's possible. And this is the essence of the challenge and the transition we need to make from a growth economy and growth imperative to a steady state economy. And this is our great transition challenge. How do we move from a growth imperative to a resilience imperative? What I'd like to do, if I can just figure out where I am, is then just say that resilience and transition as a theme is very close to the concerns for community economic development as shared, although it resets the frame. The struggle is how do we reweave our economies close to home, and our basic thesis in the book is that's essentially our task, and that the implications of climate change, peak oil, relatively corrupt global financial system means we have to reframe and reorganize the way we do things. That's something we've been struggling with for some time in community economic development, so I think it's a transition for us. It definitely positions us pretty well. The book basically deals with 3 basic needs that we think are kind of priorities as we think about transition. They're not the only ones, but food, energy, and shelter. And cross-cutting these basic needs and all the very rich examples from different parts of the world that we are able to examine, we look at key functions that in every one of we got to deal with the question of finance and how we reclaim and invest our financial resources differently. How we reclaim the commons, that is creating public space controlled by the community in a variety of different kinds of ways, can be government, but certainly not only or necessarily, to reclaim the commons in order to create opportunities for the public benefit to begin to displace some of the private wealth creation that is at the heart of the inequity in our system, and then how to democratize and localize ownership. So what I want to do is just give you a couple of examples from the book, and the first is from Japan. Yeah.
Do that, Mike. You're going to give a couple examples, just 2 illustrations from the book, the first on food, but I want to ask people to listen carefully for the elements of these stories, to think about what the transition to more resilient communities implies, especially as we think about it from a community economic development perspective. Mm-hmm. So you're going to talk about food to start?
Yeah, I want to talk about food. I want to talk about it in the context of Japan and a cooperative called Saikatsu. And it started with a group of women around a kitchen table, essentially worried about the context. I remember Japan, people there were coming out of the Second World War. They knew hunger, and food and hunger and the quality of and accessibility of food was a key kind of issue. They were also worried about the losses of farmland going on, the safety and quality of their food. And what happened is that they, as they discussed this, decided that they were going to see whether or not they might approach a local farm family, and would that family, I'm just hung up here again. So they did. And essentially, here's the deal. Would this farmer provide their families with, fresh milk, fruits, vegetables, grown without chemicals? And the farmer says, all right. They offered a fair price, but the farmer says, all right, you guarantee to buy all my production, and we got a deal. And the contract was drawn up, and the concept of takai was born, which means partnership literally, but philosophically it means food with a farmer's face on it. Interestingly, for those of you that are involved in local food, this is the origin, really, of community-supported agriculture as a concept and migrated to North America. What emerged was a collective purchasing model, which a group of 7 to 10, could be many more, but up to 20, 25, would meet together, plan what they were going to purchase in line with their social and ecological objectives, and start to build the relationships with producers directly that guaranteed their production at a fair price. And they developed, federated into a cooperative over time, and that cooperative structure specified really strict standards for, production, packing materials, environmental practices, which were then negotiated with the producers. And as these small groups grew, into more than 350,000 members today, called Han groups, they built a system that aggregated these HANs into cooperatives, of which there's now 32 consumer cooperatives, which again are aggregated into the Saikatsu Union Club at the national level. It's a pretty amazing result in a mere 40 years. They now have sales just in the food sector of around $1.1 billion a year, and they have equity of $1 billion in this system. And they have transformed not only the relationship between consumers and growers, but also started to transform the entire value chain, processing and so on. But imagine $1 billion, and due mainly to members voluntarily paying $11 per month until he or she has contributed $3,500. Right? So democratic autonomy, safe food, ecologically grown, fair price. Consumers, in this example, are essentially co-producers of a food system transformation, and that's kind of a key part of this story. I'll just illustrate a little bit how the system works in terms of how it impacts on the food chain. So if you think of a mega supermarket, there's around 300,000 different products that are operating and available to people. If you think of a regular co-op in Japan, there's 9,000 products. Saikatsu only selects 1,600 products, or 1,600 high-quality products, that they then limit their members in terms of purchasing. There's a number of things that happen as a result of this. Number one, the costs of inventory drop significantly. There's a lot less waste. Fewer products means fewer farmers. Fewer products means farmers and processors and bottlers and transporters can gain efficiencies and lower costs. And it also means less carbon. Yeah, there's all the things. Okay, so for instance, they only allow 8 bottles to be used, returnable bottles, in their system. That alone, just that one innovation, 2007, had an impact of 2,100 tons of carbon. Okay, now to ensure the specifications are met, Saikatsu's established its own independent auditing system, and you'll see here kind of how the social capital that's built within this system plays itself out. Members and producers in the different sectors of the food system set the standards together. They also audit together and see if they're being met. Consider, in the recent 4-year period, 6,500 people participated in 790 unannounced spot inspections. So this is pretty amazing. You can think of the learning that takes place, but you can also see the cost savings over regular certification practices. So there's much more that I can be said about this. I'm going to leave it for now. They've moved into a number of other areas in green energy, senior hair care, home care. They have 600 worker-owned enterprises. It's a pretty amazing story.
It is the story.
Yeah,
with the question of local ownership, democratization, the implications for ecological, carbon emissions, but also the reduction in choices that consumers are willing to accept in order to ensure they have affordable, high-quality products. It is amazing. $1 billion in equity due to member solidarity and contribution. So, it's a lot to take in at once. Can you try to, before we get into our second example, can you apply this in general terms to what it means for resiliency?
Okay. Well, let me just say, I think you can see at work that this system, that resilience is being strengthened. Resilience essentially is the ability, in community terms, ability of community to withstand external stresses and pressures in a way that allows it to keep its essential functions going. And I think in the context of the challenges we face, you can see that this kind of system is moving people towards transition to a low-carbon future. And so I could say, you can see up there modularity. That's a good resilience term. Essentially, that things are decentralized. You have the basic HAN. You got people relating at that level. A lot of social capital that's built into that, and you have a way of aggregating and federating, so people continue to be connected on a broader basis, and yet carrying some responsibility on a more local basis, and that's really kind of key. So social capital, it's modularized, it's adding to the overall diversity. You can see that the feedback inside the system and the way people make decisions is distributed in a variety of different ways to ensure that, at the core of it, the ecological and kind of socio-economic values, fair price, organic growing methods, better quality of food, these are ways in which these are values that are kind of being reinforced through the way in which they've organized their system. And that kind of moves right from the very local level up to the federated level and the national level, but with an accountability that still has a base in the communities.
Well, let's look at another example to illustrate it. I want to get to our second example because I want to have time for questions at the end. There's a couple of questions that have been posted, and I would encourage other people to go ahead and post your questions now if you want to get on them. But your second example is on finance.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to give another example on finance because it's a function. Just let me get my notes here. This second innovation is the Jack Cooperative Bank in Sweden, and this is a fascinating national example in Sweden that is almost totally countercultural to the way we think about finance in North America in terms of either household or business-related finance. So the core feature of the Jack Cooperative Bank is that they don't charge compound interest. They charge fees for financing, not compound interest. And they have a lot of different reasons that they do this. And their first point is really simple, although it's something that until I actually was involved in writing this book, I didn't understand. That is that the embedded costs of compound interest have a huge impact on our cost of living, and it's shocking just how much. You can see this German research that's depicted in this graphic, that across the economy, you think of the supply chains that make up every kinds of business, so whether it's garbage collection or a public service like sewage and so on and so forth, 35% of the cost of essential goods and services were found to be embedded as a result of the charges of compound interest across the value chain, across the supply chains. And not only that, as it increased the cost, the transfer of wealth represented is amazing. 600 million euros daily from the bottom 80% of the population to the top 10%. So here you got a question of how this system of compound interest is creating inequality, as well as questions about sustainability. They also don't like it because smaller enterprises, social enterprises, ecological enterprises that may yield and do yield often a lower financial return. It's just too little profit. Transaction costs are too high. Compound interest, you got to cover those costs in addition. It's a problem. a big problem that they saw, though, was really the ecological limits problem, that if you've got debt, like we do in the economy at every level, from the household to government to private sector debt, it essentially creates a huge, rapid treadmill requiring us to grow endlessly in order to pay the costs of that system. So that's why they did it. And what they do is basically they set up what you can think of as a solidarity lending system, and I'll just show you how it works. Basically, it requires people to save what they want to borrow. So if you have looking at $5,000, this person here is pre-saved some money. They get a basic loan based on what they have saved, and then they can contract to continue to save in order to increase the loan size. Now, this is, here's the kicker in this, is that the benefit is that the cost of these loans are 2.5 to 3% of the value of the loan, which is much cheaper than the average interest rate in Canada over the last 35 years, which has been 8%. That's good, but you have to save the amount you want to borrow. If you want to borrow $5,000, then you're going to have to save $5,000, which means higher monthly payments. So this clearly isn't a system for low-income people. However, for moderate middle-class people in Sweden, the net result has been, at the end of the day, you've saved a tremendous amount of money on interest charges, and at the end of the payoff, you've got a nest egg savings that you've made in the course of getting access to the credit. Now, what would that mean in Canada today? If you look at, average home is $370,000. You come in with your 10% down. You got a mortgage of $333,000. Based on the Jack system versus the average of 8% over the last 35 years, you're going to save a net $307,000 in interest payments. So it has a huge impact when you think of life, energy, and cash at the household level. But it's also had some innovations that have taken place in relationship to business financing. One of the industries in central Sweden that was virtually dead was related to the livestock and particularly sheep. And essentially, the system that they built for financing business was key. And excuse me, they created an innovation based on this solidarity savings idea that they call a local enterprise bank. And I just want to show you how it works. The first local enterprise bank that they set up was to get a small slaughterhouse started way up in the northwest part of the country. And there were three motivations. First, there was a lobby in the country around ethical treatment of animals. There was a concern for how do we protect and support small farmers, particularly in remote regions where they're being put out of business potentially or under threat from large feedlots and packing plants. And how could they, with these farmers who are practicing ecological forest management, keep them on the land? And essentially, the idea of the slaughterhouse and value added was to help that economic viability of the entire effort. And of course, no bank would touch them. So some Jack members who lived in the region, they heard about the project and talked to the farmers and got a business plan, and they asked Jack Bank to look it over and asked that they set up a savings account to be set up in the name of the project so savings could be organized in support of the project by people who wanted to see this work. This is, my friends, what a local enterprise bank is, a particular deposit account in the Jack Bank. So it didn't take long Jack members in the region and the bank put savings in, and the Swedish SPCA launched a savings campaign with their members. Jack members, as I said, contracted to save local businesses and citizens from the regions. The farmers transferred savings into the local enterprise bank, and within 3 months, they had sufficient capital and working capital to get the Farmers Cooperative started. So to me, it's pretty amazing, right? The simple savings account bank, who would have thought, right? Self-organizing, autonomous, decentralized. Most of the projects that they've done are in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. However, there's one that's been a key component, putting a $10 million wind co-op financing in place. So what I like about this particular example is that it kind of thinks macro, but it's really creating an empowerment framework for people to deal with things on a very local or regional basis. So I think that's basically what I have to say for now, Mike. And I think
you just
took a little bit too long.
That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just to compare, for example, with Saikatsu, can you illustrate what some of the resilience factors are then for the Jack example?
Well, I think they're very similar in many ways to it's a decentralized model. It's modular in that there's 20, I think there's 35 or so branches. They mobilize their savings on a local basis, but they're federated on a national basis. Members and volunteers, they got about 650 volunteers across the system. So there's a high level of engagement. People know each other. They're certainly creating financing sources that allow a lot more innovation in how people approach financing local social and ecological enterprises. Adds to the overall diversity, obviously, of financing sources within the country. And I think those are kind of the main points. The system obviously has a whole lot of communication that's built into it, and kind of, I think, really represents an innovation in what we might call solidarity finance that is very instructive. And as we think about how we reweave our economies on a more local and regional basis, it's certainly not the only answer by any means, but it's illustrative of the kind of things we need to think about as we recalibrate the way we put our own money to work where we live.
And it is amazing to see what is possible going on around the world with time and the right conditions and strategic choices. We do have some questions already that I'd like to get to. I'll invite other people, if you have questions, to post them up there in the chat room. And obviously there was a lot of material covered in the presentation today, and there's lots more in the book. Go ahead and post your questions, and we'll get through as many as we can. So, for example, one question that Kelly posted that I think was one of the first things that came to mind too. Saikatsu is so big in Japan. They've been around for 40 years, and there may be some other conditions. What are the barriers to continued development, for example, of community-supported agriculture or others in Canada? Is it really transferable? How can we apply some of these examples in Canada?
Well, I think the most striking thing to me is that, and I think there is a uniqueness to some extent in the Japanese context, and it comes from their awareness of hunger, the trauma of the war, and the traditional association with food. Cultural terms is very deep. Traditionally. So, there's a predisposition there to think about and organize because there's consciousness. People can see what was going on, and they were conscious of it because they had a historical reason to be aware and conscious that was in their own interest and in their community's interest. I think that the biggest obstacle is is our cultural predisposition as consumers. That if we're going to play our role in transforming the food system, it has to be premised on seeing the world differently than consumer culture currently sees it, and that's a generalization. So if we can't see that the trend lines that we are facing from a point of view of fossil fuels, a commodity-oriented production system, and climate change, we're not going to look for alternatives. So I think what's happening is that we're seeing this growth in local food, a huge difference in only a decade across the continent, and a huge range of innovations that are taking place that Saikatsu speaks to. I think you could almost see what's going on in North America almost pre-Saikatsu. That is, people are becoming aware, they're conscious, they're doing things, they're innovating. But what I think is missing is that consumers are still thinking of themselves as, okay, I'll go to the farmer's market and I'll buy and pay a bit more, and I feel good about that. And, you know, we instinctually almost know that we have to do things differently. But the challenge for us, and I think absolutely Saikatsu can be replicated if it is recognized that part of our job is to organize as consumers and start seeing ourselves as co-producers of the food system. And that's going to take effort. But as the crisis deepens, I think we're going to find that that the kind of food system that Saikatsu has built is precisely the kinds of things that we need to build here. And I think a lot of people are thinking about.
So it sounds like George hit the nail on the head. One of his comments in the chat box was wanting to understand better the member profile of Japanese, of Saikatsu, and the values regarding success and well-being, and their attitude towards food security and health. And so it sounds like you're saying that that is a big part of it. Yeah. Heidi asked a question here regarding the Jack Bank. She's interested in what the solidarity lending system model might look like for low-income people. And have you done any thinking about what does that model have any implications for lower-income members or participants?
I don't think, frankly, that the Jack model is. I mean, you'd have to deal with some innovations and some tweaking to try and figure out how you could build in this being relevant to low-income people. I mean, the savings requirement in and of itself creates a problem, creates a very stable and resilient system, but it doesn't deal with that segment of the community. I think, you know, there's some much more interesting, in the book, some much more interesting models from the point of view of low-income people, poverty reduction, and empowerment through innovative linking together of credit and debt advice and money advice that you'll see in the community banking partnerships, and a number of the partnerships that have been built between community development financial institutions, which migrated into the UK from US, and which are playing a role in a variety of areas, including you know, fuel poverty, energy efficiency, linked to decreasing costs in communities, and in relationship to renovations, the whole notion of how the various financial tools are structured and calibrated to actually benefit low-income people, social landlords, municipalities, and get a public benefit as well as a very direct benefit for low-income people. I think there's some very, very interesting things to be built on there. But Jack, in and of itself, I don't think is a model that is going to solve access to finance problems for low-income people.
Good thoughts there. Sean had another sort of big-scale question asking about the entry points for these models, transferring them to U.S. and Canada. How do we get started, and what are some of the examples in the Canadian context? And I think on the chat box there's been some examples that have been put up there, and resources. Yvonne, I posted a link to Urgency for information about CSI and Saikatsu, and Lynn has just mentioned the West End Food Co-op, which has opened a new store and cannery in Toronto, which is terrific, just a few years after the last cannery in the Niagara region finally closed its doors. So
cool.
What do you think about entry points for this practice in the U.S. and Canada?
That's a really important question, and clearly community economic development has tended to be focused on territory and putting the pieces together in territory, although I think it's fair to say that some of our work has been on sectors, and organizing has been primarily focused on territory. I think for some of these innovations, like for instance in the food or community land trusts, which is of course growing up in the United States and we're just starting to bring into the Canadian context, and their application to affordable housing, the application to in agriculture, to how we deal with succession and an aging generation of farmers, and how we, there's a whole series of issues where we have to figure out how do we deal with this, taking the essence of an innovation and then adapting it and scaling. I think the key to this, or one of the keys to it, is that when we're talking about our work at the community and sub-regional levels, that organizing on a stakeholder basis is also very important. So in the food context, how people across the food system in a particular locality or sub-region organize to understand and assess the strengths and weaknesses of the system with respect to local food, that process of identifying and having a basic agreement that it's important to work at this agenda in a strategic way, and then go through the processes of identifying what the critical priorities are and then mobilizing finance and others to meet those priorities. That multi-stakeholder process that links activists, finance, progressive sectors of the private sector, and interests that are potentially supportive in the public sector is the critical piece, because those stakeholders are the ones with a combination of knowledge, expertise, and motivation to carry the process within a particular region or community. I know that in the UK right now, Pat Conaty, my co-author, has been taking community land trusts as an affordable housing innovation out of the United States, and has systematically helped organize people on a multi-stakeholder basis in different communities and regions. I mean, and that movement is now on the verge of takeoff. There's many that are in place and building housing and many more in the process, but it was that local gathering together of stakeholders, going through in the book what we call the Commonwealth Wheel, where you move from gathering people to actually going through the process of launch. Stuff that we all know something about if we've been in the practice. That's key to taking the innovations where we live and adapting it. I think in shelter, in terms of land trusts, in terms of food and transforming food systems, in terms of how we deal with intergenerational transition, that isn't by itself going to do the whole trick. but it is, from a methodological point of view, one of the places that we start and can start in any of these sectors.
Well, we're just about out of time. It sounds like Sean is already on that path when he talked about having the food banks bring together different players in the food system to address those issues, producers, storage, disposal. So that's encouraging work. His last question, whether your research was a Cura grant, it was based on a Cura grant, a lot of research coming out of the BC Alberta Social Economy Research Alliance, and we can post a link to that in the chat room. But Mike, just wrapping up in 1 minute, there's obviously much to be done. We're at a critical time, but you talked at the beginning about moving from despair to hope. Do you have a couple of words in terms of looking forward?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's right. That's a funny slide that Don McNair did, eh? Yeah, we're in this point, and how do we kind of do we dare take off the cover of that third statue? Yeah, well, I kind of took this personal motto from a Welsh poet that's anonymous, actually, but our job is to make hope more convincing or concrete and despair less convincing. I think we're at a juncture where on the one hand, almost weekly, the news seems to be becoming more grim. The other thing, though, that I monitor weekly is, that the innovation, that the level of activity across the globe is absolutely incredibly stimulating and hopeful. So it's like resting with this tension is part of what we have to adopt if we're going to be able to sustain effort. We cannot know what the outcome is going to be. We do know we have no choice but to engage. And I think, emotionally and spiritually and culturally, we're going through a huge transition that is reshaping both our inner lives, if we allow it, ourselves to go through and hold the tension, and also have huge implications for systems that we live in and our efforts to transform them. So I think when I finish this book in the back alley here, I knew it was possible, that we could turn and bend the curve of history, if you will, but I didn't know if it was probable, and I think that's the tension I continue to live with. But I definitely see lots of things across the globe that are very, almost like we have a DNA or an immune system that is it's like we're being slowly inoculated to a point of view that we know we have to change, and almost instinctually we're starting to move in that direction. And some of the examples in this book, and that, even the two that I talked about, I think they represent a systemic way of taking that forward, and are hopeful and instructive.
So the book is full of practical tools and examples that are both inspirational and concrete. So there's the link for people who are interested in buying it. Of course, you can get it on Amazon or your local independent bookseller, hopefully, but look up Resilience Imperative, and I encourage people who are considering it to pick it up. There are specific excerpts from the book available on the communityrenewal.ca website, and there's a link to those from the webinar page that you want to register for this session. So if you want to read more before buying the book, there's information there. We're out of time. Everyone should have just received an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. Please take a second and fill it out right away. Your feedback is very important to us. It's particularly important because there will be more webinars like this. If you have suggestions for other topics, please share them with us. There should be a link for that in the email as well, and you can register now for upcoming sessions. Our next session is on November 7th, when we'll get secret tips on financial management from another CEDNet founding member and CED leader, Walter Hossley. I'd like to say a special thanks again to Mike Lewis for his powerful analysis and compelling presentation in the book and the session today, and for, of course, all his leadership over many years. And a special thanks to all the participants who joined us for the session. The exchanges in the chat room and the questions were very rich, and that's the great benefit of being part of this network. So there's still a bit of activity in the chat room. So the formal portion of the webinar will end here, but we'll leave the chat room open for people if there are other links or contact info or ideas you want to share. The recording will be posted on our website, and since all of you are either CEDNet members or paid to attend this session, we'll make sure you get the link to the recording so you'll be able to review the slides and listen to the presentation again if you like. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.